Nice to have all you here this afternoon. What names did our ancestors give to their children? Investigating this very personal act is one of the important clues that our ancestors left us about themselves and about their culture. So I'm hoping that with this talk, we can look at some of the methods you can use for understanding the use of names and naming practices, because when they are used cautiously and properly, they can help us with our research. What's in a name? The decision that a parent made to give a particular name to a child is, as I said, a very personal act and is often embedded with all sorts of connotations. Names can reflect tradition in a family. A child can be named for an earlier relative, a grandparent, a great-grandparent, a sibling who died, or a close family friend whom the birth parent wished to honor. Names can reflect social norms and cultural influences, depending on what exactly prevailed in the culture of the parents at the time of the birth. If it was common to name children using the naming customs of a foreign culture, and then the family moved to America, those same cultural forces may or may not have been maintained. The reasons behind whether they were maintained or abandoned will be discussed. Names can certainly reflect the influence of religious traditions. If your ancestors attended a particular church or belonged to a certain denomination, there may have been strong religious forces that influenced their decision to give a child a particular name. Similarly, there might have been some prevailing cultural or interest or trend. A child might also be named for someone important in the history of the country, a king, a president, a general, a national hero, or a religious leader. Over time, many families lost the traditional influences and chose names for their children based on cultural trends and what was fashionable at the time. This was definitely true in America by the second half of the 19th century, when names of popular figures, literary characters, and names considered trendy became popular. You may find virtue names among your Puritan or Quaker ancestors, names like Patience and Charity, which exemplified religious or civic virtues that the parents valued. You may find quirky names, names made up by the parents just for the sake of being unusual or eccentric. Finally, a name may be chosen for a child without any of the above influences. A child named John or Mary may just be that, a common name of no other significance to the parents other than that it was easy to remember. How do we get inside the minds of our ancestors and know what they were thinking when they came up with a particular name? The short answer is that we can't. The longer answer is that we may sometimes get clues from their culture that will provide us some answers, however imperfect our reasoning may be. Studying names is essential to the historical interpretation of a family. The historian Daniel Scott Smith has written, quote, "The naming of children was never a trivial act," unquote. It gives us as researchers a chance to get to know our ancestors better. If a naming pattern involves perpetuating or honoring earlier generations, such as grandparents, then the use of those names can give us valuable clues about those earlier generations, especially when we may be facing a brick wall in our research. Names of children may also help us distinguish two people of the same name living in the same area, or resolve conflicts when a mother can be placed in two different birth families. We have to be very careful when we look at naming patterns. We don't want to overemphasize what we find or reach the wrong conclusion. We need to study very closely the cultural milieu of the area and the time period of the ancestor in question. Then we ask ourselves, what were other people doing at the time? If a certain prevailing custom existed, did our ancestor follow it in choosing the names for his children? Even when there was a strong social custom, it is always possible that an ancestor deviated from that custom. We can never completely be certain. However, we may be able to discern a pattern from other names and from looking at additional evidence. In Western European culture, children traditionally received their official name at the time of their baptism. That was especially true for both Catholics and certain Protestant churches that practiced infant baptism. Sometimes baptism occurred very close to the date of the child's birth. There was a prevailing belief at the time of high infant mortality that a child would be lost to hell if it was not baptized. As time wore on, especially in some cultures in the 19th century, a greater interval happened between the date of birth and the date of baptism. Sometimes children were not named right away after birth. When mortality was high and infant baptism was not practiced, it was easier on the parents if the baby died without a formal name. Sometimes you will see on census records very young children, less than a year old, having no name or being recorded simply as baby. If parents waited a few months before establishing a strong bond with their infant, it was easier emotionally if the child died. Sometimes bonding, of course, was inevitable. Let's begin our study by looking at naming patterns in the British Isles. England has some of the oldest records in Europe, and there are records of baptisms from churches dating back to the early part of the 16th century. Historians have undertaken formal academic studies in an attempt to discern naming patterns from these records. Scott Smith Bannister, in his book Names and Naming Patterns in England, 1538 to 1700, states that the evidence from the earliest of these registers before 1600 shows that children were often given the names of godparents who witnessed a baptism. Godparents played an important role across Europe. If a child's parents died, the godparents would assume responsibility for raising the orphan. Sometimes they were relatives or close friends of the parents. As we will later see when we look at Germany and America, these parents were often given the chance to name the child, and often they named it after themselves. In Banbury, Oxfordshire, according to one study, 86% of the children baptized in the 1550s received the names of their godparents. Of course, this custom might have differed in other parts of England, and there has been no system-wide study of all the parish registers in England. We have a snapshot, and historians have projected that snapshot on the culture. During the English Civil War of the 1640s and 1650s, when Oliver Cromwell deposed the king and put his Puritan government in place, the Church of England was disestablished and godparents were banned. The same also held true in colonial New England, which was heavily influenced by Puritan custom. When Charles II returned to the throne in 1660, the Church of England was reestablished and the custom of godparents returned, but the custom of naming children after godparents had declined by this date. Even before Cromwell, naming patterns in England began to change in the 17th century. It became common to name children after their grandparents, aunts and uncles, and other parents, people in the family. The pattern had a number of slight variants, but it came to prevail in Scotland and Ireland, as we shall see. The pattern goes as follows. Eldest son named for the father's father, second son for the mother's father, third son for the father, fourth son for the eldest paternal uncle, eldest daughter for the mother's mother, second daughter for the father's mother, third daughter for the mother, fourth daughter for the eldest maternal aunt. You have to be very careful with this naming pattern because it was far from universally used and had a lot of variations. While the eldest son was quite often named for the father's father, other factors may have mitigated the arrangement. For example, if the mother's father had been especially close and gave the family a quantity of land, the eldest son may have been named for the mother's father's name. You have to look at other records such as deeds and wills to see if any parts of the naming pattern can be verified. Other naming systems were also in play at the same time the grandparent naming pattern was in use. Naming a child after the reigning monarch was very popular. During the 18th century, you'll see lots of children named George, named after one of the kings, even if the name George is not run in the family. You also will find names such as Richard and Arthur, historic names in English history, King Arthur being very popular. Biblical names were also popular, especially among the Puritans and later among Baptists and other evangelical Christians. Old Testament prophets and patriarchs such as Moses, Ezekiel, Abraham, and Noah were used much more frequently as first names beginning in the mid-1600s. Finding such a name in a family may indicate that it was religious, but it may not necessarily indicate the name of an earlier relative. David Hackett Fisher, in his book Albion's Seed, states that in 17th century Boston, 90% of all names were taken from the Bible. In Hingham, in Plymouth Colony, the number was as high as 95%. 50% of all girls were named either Mary, Elizabeth, or Sarah. Rebecca was also popular, as were Anne or Hannah, Deborah, Huldah, Abigail, Rachel, and Ruth. Of boys' names, the most common were John, Joseph, Samuel, and Josiah. Some names were considered taboo, such as Jesus, Angel, and Emmanuel. You won't see those in New England culture. We already talked about the popularity of virtue names. I will see more about those in a moment. They were related to names for biblical figures because they represented religious virtues that were prized by the parents. I have an ancestor named Solomon Stanley who was kicked out of his Quaker meeting in Hanover County, Virginia in 1776 for marrying a woman who was not a fellow Quaker. The members of the Cedar Creek meeting wrote that he had married, quote, out of unity. Of his several daughters, one was named Unity and the other was named Charity. So perhaps there was some deeper meaning to the names because of his situation with his Quaker meeting. Some families practice the tradition of replacement names, or what we would call necronyms. If a child died, a later child would be given the name of the deceased earlier one. If a family followed this custom, it will throw the generational naming pattern completely out of whack. This practice was also very popular in Puritan New England. Finally, you may have last names being used as first names. This custom was very popular in the American South for the Revolution and until well into the 20th century. You will see it to some extent also in the British Isles. It was a way to honor the maiden name of the mother or a paternal or maternal grandmother. Whenever you see an unusual name pop up in a group of children, a name that sounds like a surname, you should take it very seriously as a genealogist and try to determine where the name came from. Was it a family member, a neighbor, a clergyman? They can be really useful in terms of tracing extended family members, but you have to be careful because they may have been honoring a family friend rather than using a family name. Patriarchal naming pattern was even more popular in Ireland and Scotland than it was in England. You definitely see this practice in Irish records as well as in the first generation or two among Scots-Irish settlers in America. As before, the pattern goes, eldest son for the father's father, second son for the mother's father, third son for the father, eldest daughter for either the father's mother or the mother's mother, the second daughter in reverse of the previous, the third daughter for the mother. The most common boys' names among the Scots-Irish were John, James, William, Alexander, and Robert. By the third quarter of the 18th century, you will sometimes see middle names being used to honor earlier family members. An eldest daughter, for example, may not have only her maternal grandmother's first name, but also her maiden name as a middle name. When this happens, and you can actually find a written record of a full name, it can be a great clue for further information. The problem is you sometimes can't find what the middle name is. You may only get the initial. The challenge in reconstructing naming patterns is often gathering a complete list of the children. Not all of them may appear in baptismal records. The oldest surviving son in a family may not necessarily be the oldest son. The one with his father's name may have died young without any record. Now, the Scots-Irish in the American frontier continued to perpetuate this pattern, at least in the 18th century. I've seen it through Pennsylvania and into Virginia and the Carolinas. But it began to evolve and disappear by the beginning of the 19th century. There was a strong interest in a great variety of names, including Celtic names such as Ewan and Owen, names after border places such as Ross or Clyde, the names of saints such as Andrew, the patron saint of Scotland, Patrick, the patron saint of Ireland, and David, the patron saint of Wales. There was also a spirit of what David Hackett Fisher calls onomastic individualism. These names were rare and sometimes invented by the parents or chosen from obscure origins. Irish naming pattern is very similar to the Scots-Irish pattern with some slight differences. Eldest son for the father's father, second son for the mother's father, third son after other relatives, not necessarily the father. Eldest daughter for the father's mother, second daughter for the mother's mother, third daughter after other relatives. Rosemary Folliott, the longtime editor of the Irish Ancestor, stated her opinion after many years that the naming the eldest son after the father's father was almost a universal tradition throughout Ireland in the 18th century. You can almost rely on it with genealogical certitude if you get a complete list of the children. However, the eldest daughter was often named for the father's mother as often as the mother's mother, and it was so commonly alternated that you cannot rely upon it genealogically. So let's take a look in my own family history of my own family Bible. I don't own this, but a cousin of mine does. I want to show you how it works and how it operated in unlocking my own family history. This Bible shows the children of James Beatty and his wife Anne Bennett of the town of Ballycanoe in County Wexford, Ireland. All of the children were born between 1771 and 1783, which was a time within the culture when naming patterns were being actively used. That's important, because if this was a Bible from 100 years later in the 1870s, I would not use it at all as a case study for naming patterns, because the naming patterns by that time were not in place. But in the 18th century, yes, they were very strong. So eldest son, born 1771, named James. Second son, Leonard, born 1773. John, born 1774. Elizabeth, born 1776. Susanna in 1778. Dempster, very unusual name, born in 1781. And Anne, born in 1783. So is there a naming pattern being used here? Well, we need to dig deeper. So the first thing we need to do is the eldest son is named James. It's not likely, given the custom, that the father would have named the eldest son after himself. That was just not the custom in Ireland. So we can have a pretty good idea from the ancestral custom that the James being used was the father's name as well as the grandfather's name. That's really important. That was an important clue for me in trying to dig back further into the family. And we also have a good idea that the second son's name was Leonard, was named after Leonard Bennett, because there is indeed a Leonard Bennett in the records of the town where the family lived. There was a Leonard Bennett who was assigned a pew in the church in 1760. So he was clearly an older person. So we can be pretty certain that, in fact, quite certain that Leonard was the name of the mother's father. So that part of the naming pattern seems to be followed. The third son is named John, and in this case, since the father's father, James, was also the name of the father, they wouldn't have used it twice. So they chose another name, John, which may be a brother's name. We can't be completely sure. We look further into the daughters. The first two daughters are Elizabeth and Susanna, likely the names of the mothers of James and Anne, but we can't be certain of the order. We would want to look for other documents and records in church records and other things to see if we can find an Elizabeth and a Susanna being used with the Beattys and with the Bennetts in earlier records. Unfortunately for me, I haven't been able to find any such documents. So I still don't know for sure whether Elizabeth was James's mother or Anne's mother, and whether Susanna was the other one. But I'm quite sure those were the two names. I just don't know which order to put them in. The third daughter, Anne, was certainly named for her mother, so she was following the tradition. So what about Dempster? Here's a really unusual thing. Here's a vestry minute book from the town where I show James Beatty, my ancestor's signature, and his father-in-law, Leonard Bennett. They all signed the vestry book, and there's evidence firsthand right there of Leonard and James knowing each other, being together in the same records. Dempster is a really unusual name. It's the name of the fourth son. It does not follow a usual naming pattern. It alerts us to be on the lookout for this name in other types of documents. It could be a maiden name being used as a first name, but we have to be careful because this was not always the case. It could be the name of a family friend, but we can use it as a valuable clue to connect James with other Beattys, and indeed it becomes the clue that unlocks my family tree. We can look at voters' registers. These are digitized online on the Patronymics website, the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, and I looked at those. I know that the town where my family was likely from was a town called Donaghcloney in County Down. We look at the registers there, and there are indeed Beattys there and David Dempster on the same list in the same parish. This is interesting to me because Dempster is a very, very rare name. I got to thank my great-great-great-great-grandfather, his son, this, because he was giving the clue that his descendants would need to find him later on. We have a will, and in my family, I'm very lucky because there was a genealogist in Ireland by the name of Philip Crossley, and he did work on a lot of families before the big fire that happened in Dublin in 1922. And one of the families that he worked on was the Beatty name, because there was a famous admiral in England. I'm not related to him, but he was in the World War I. His name was Sir David Beatty, Earl of the North Sea. And because he had become famous in World War I and had Irish ancestry, Philip Crossley wanted to trace his family. So he went into the records and transcribed every Beatty document that he could possibly find before the fire. And these documents, of course, the originals burned up when the great explosion and fire happened in 1922. But we have Crossley's notes. We have his abstracts. And in going through all of his will abstracts, I did find a will for a James Beatty who left a bequest to a stepson, also named James Beatty, leaving him a colt. And the will was witnessed by Samuel Dempster and Marmaduke Dempster. And that's quite interesting because Samuel and Marmaduke Dempster are the father and uncle of another guy named David Dempster. My ancestor was a miller. He left County Down. He went down into County Wexford, and there are lists in the journals of the Irish House of Commons of all the millers in Ireland who produced flour and sent flour to Dublin for reimbursement. And so we have the name of the miller at Newtownbarry was David Dempster, same guy who was on that voting list that we looked at a minute ago. And there's my ancestor James Beatty down at Ballyconnew, down at the bottom. And it turns out they had come to County Wexford together, that Dempster had brought my ancestor with him and that they had known each other. And when David Dempster died in 1818, he left a will in which he names a number of Beattys as his tenants and his friends. The Beattys witnessed the will. And just by luck, that one survived in a collection of lawyers' records. So I was able to really show through this record that these are the Beattys that I come from, that my James Beatty was the son of this other James Beatty that was listed in that will, and that the Dempsters, by association, gave me the clues that allowed me to unlock the family. So let's talk a little bit about the advent of middle names in Britain and America. Middle names were rare in the British Isles in America until the last quarter of the 18th century. The exception would be Germans in America who had middle names at a much earlier date, but we will talk about that later. Among British descended people, middle names began to appear after 1775 and became increasingly popular by 1820. 5% of people had middle names in 1775, but by 1820, 70% had them. It can be very difficult to find documentary evidence of a middle name. You will find records of people using a middle initial, but rarely is their full middle name given or ever written out, especially if they are not of a Germanic background. Family Bibles, church records, and tombstones are probably the best sources. Earliest middle names were often the surnames of earlier ancestors or close relatives. So it can be a really valuable clue for you if you can find evidence of a full middle name of an ancestor. A son might have two names, one for each of his grandfathers, especially after the old naming custom had disappeared. Let's take a look at another case study of another ancestor of mine. This is the ancestors Isaac Beezley and Sarepta McMillan, who were married in 1832 in Clark County, Ohio. They had the following children, the first two born in Clark County, Ohio, and the remainder in Kosciuszko County here in Indiana. Mary Elizabeth, born in 1834, Elizabeth Ann in 36, William, born in 38, Jane G. in 1840, Rachel P., born in 1844. Note that we have full middle names for some of them and only hints of middle names using single initials. In this case study, we already know Isaac's side of the family. We want to know more about Sarepta, which was the brick wall in my research. She still is in some respects. Isaac was born in 1814, the son of William Beezley and Elizabeth Napper. He has a large family of brothers and sisters, including a sister Jane, who married Hezekiah Graham, and a sister Rachel, who married James Payden, hence the initial P. So one of the daughters was named Jane Graham, and the other was named Rachel Payden. And that's what those initial second daughter, William for the only son, and the two youngest daughters, Jane G. and Rachel P., all Beezley family names. So what about Mary Elizabeth, the oldest daughter? Could she have been the combined names of both her grandmothers? Well, it turns out probably yes. We chased down the clue. Sarepta was born in 1813 in Virginia, probably Fauquier County. Her father's name is Sampson McMillan. But since there were no other sons, if there had been another son born, he probably would have been named Sampson. But they only had the one son. No marriage record of Sampson and his first wife exists. So we don't know the name of Sarepta's mother. Several siblings of Sarepta are likely from the marriage records, and we know who those are. We try to trace all the McMillans around. We have a probable brother's death record, which lists Mary as his mother. So Mary emerges as the likely mother's name, even when there is no marriage record and deeds that name her. I'm able to tease it out of the Bible just because of using other death certificates of probable siblings and looking at the name as it's used in this Bible record. But we can't be 100% sure ever in this situation. We don't know, but we can tease it out as a strong possibility. We already discussed the strong preference for biblical names among Puritans, and I wanted to focus briefly on some variants of naming patterns that were present in colonial America. There have been a number of studies done by academics to analyze the use of names in early populations. A study of names from Hingham, Massachusetts before 1735 shows that 74% of firstborn daughters were named for their mothers, and 67% of firstborn sons were named for their fathers. If this pattern holds true elsewhere in New England, then Puritans were not following the more traditional naming pattern of naming the firstborn after grandparents. Instead, they named them for themselves. Biblical names often took precedence, but sometimes biblical names coincided with the names of the parents. Virtue names, which I alluded to before, were very popular among Puritans and Quakers. We should also make note of the fact that the birth order and circumstances surrounding a birth may dictate the naming of a child. The name Benoni that you'll sometimes see, and it's a biblical name, was often given to a son when the mother died in childbirth. So when you find Benoni listed, take care to look carefully at the death records to see if the mother may have died at that time. It's a clue that you can use for death because it indicates sorrow. Benjamin was often used as a name for the youngest son because the biblical Benjamin is the youngest son of Jacob. So they liked using names that had biblical associations like this. In another study that was done for Middlesex County, Virginia, for the period 1650 to 1750, this is a difficult burned county, so I'm not certain what sources the researchers used to arrive at their conclusions, but they found that just over 70% of firstborn boys were named for their fathers or their grandfathers. Just over 63% of second-born males were named for their grandparents or fathers. Of the daughters, just over 65% of firstborns were named for their mothers or grandmothers, and 58% of second-born females were named after grandmothers or mothers. So it seems like here that the grandparent naming system was in play in Virginia more so than it was in New England. So older children were being named after their parents and grandparents in the period before the Revolution. And this can be helpful to us as genealogists. The historian David Hackett Fisher remarks that while New Englanders were much more likely to name their eldest children after themselves, Virginians were more likely to name them after grandparents. And they were far more likely to give surnames as first names in honor of maiden names of women's and names of cousins, much less likely that you'll find that in New England. Virginians of Anglican tradition followed naming traditions that were similar to those of the South and West of England. Unlike the strong preference for biblical names in Puritan New England, Virginians were more likely to have names of Teutonic knights, English kings, and Frankish knights. Popular boys' names were William, Robert, Richard, Edward, George, and Charles. Popular girls' names included Margaret, Jane, Catherine, Frances, and Alice, as well as the universally popular Mary, Elizabeth, Anne, and Sarah. They were more reluctant to name later children after earlier deceased children, as was a common practice in New England. It was considered unlucky, and Fisher argues that the magical properties of names played a far more important role in the South than it did in the North. It was considered taboo to name a child after an earlier deceased child. Quakers did everything different and backwards, traditional Christian religions. And in the Delaware Valley, there's been a study of them and to look at their naming patterns. And you can't put a lot of stock in it because there were a lot of different variables at play, but essentially many of them followed a reverse naming pattern system than what we were used to. The eldest son was named for the mother's father, the second son for the father's father, the third son for the father, first daughter for the father's mother, the second daughter for the mother's mother, the third daughter for the mother. Quakers did not practice baptism, so as did other Christian denominations, so names were not assigned as part of that ritual. Names of children were nominated by the parents and witnessed by the neighbors and then solemnly entered into the Quaker meeting minutes. That's how naming patterns were done in that tradition. Quakers also liked biblical names as well as virtue names, which may or may not reflect earlier generations. Some of the more interesting names were restore, freedom, increase, remember, and preserve. In the colonial period of America, many immigrant groups continued to maintain the same naming customs as they did in the New World. However, after the Revolutionary War, American society began to develop its own unique identity more rapidly than the earlier years of settlement. By that time, immigration had changed everything. Moving to a new country meant that many people gave up their old ways, language, diet, and customs. Immigration to America meant that families adopted a totally new set of customs. They probably retained their religion and may have kept some of the food ways, but they also wanted to assimilate. Old world naming patterns were frequently a casualty of the new surroundings. Immigrant parents wanted their children to fit in, to find jobs. They may have had an ethnic name that was translated into English. Carl may have become Charles. Wilhelm may have become William. There were new tastes that dictated choices of names. Parents wanted their sons and daughters to have fashionable names and not be burdened with something from the European tradition. Political, religious, and military heroes were popular subjects. With the 19th century, society became increasingly less patriarchal or male-dominated. Fathers and mothers together had a hand in choosing names. Religious figures, some of them lesser known today, also became popular choices for the names of children, not necessarily immigrant children, but even native-born children. John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, proved very popular among Protestants, and you will see John W. or John Wesley, or even just Wesley as a name in a family, and it can be a clue that the family was Methodist. Lorenzo Dow from 1777 to 1834, born in Connecticut, was also a founding Methodist leader, as was Francis Asbury. So you'll sometimes see Lorenzo D. and Francis A. Among children of Methodist families. Both men preached to large crowds in England and in America and won many converts. George Whitefield, who was the Billy Graham of his day and was also an early convert to Methodism, he preached to large crowds in the mid-1700s. Many children were named after these leaders well into the 19th century. Families owned books with their printed sermons and religious writings and passed them down to their children. So they were huge celebrities of their time. Politicians were also extremely popular choices in the first 3/4 of the 19th century. Many families named their children after one of the founding fathers: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Andrew Jackson. Popular senators were also favorites, like Henry Clay and Daniel Webster. Sometimes you'll get clues about the politics of your ancestor by the naming choices of politicians they chose. If a family gave their son the name Andrew Jackson, they were likely Democrats. If they named them after Henry Clay or Daniel Webster, they were likely Whigs. Military heroes were also very popular: captains, generals, and admirals. Some had more regional significance than others. Oliver Hazard Perry, the hero of the Battle of Lake Erie in the War of 1812, became a very popular naming choice in the 1810s to the 1830s, especially children born in the upper Midwest, in Michigan and Ohio and Western New York and Indiana and that area. There were lots of Oliver P's you'll see in among children. Francis Marion was a Revolutionary War hero from South Carolina, and that name, Francis M., you'll see that in lots of families in the Carolinas. And William Henry Harrison, who became the popular general, governor of Indiana, later won the presidency in 1840 in a popular campaign to pick a new Tyler too. You'll see lots of families who are Whigs who have William H. among their names of their children. I touched on this early, but there were changes in the husband-wife dynamic throughout the 18th century and into the 19th century. In the 1600s and even up to the Revolutionary War, men were patriarchs. They were the rulers of their family. They wrote wills in which they planned out in great detail the heritage of their children. Daughters had to obtain permission from their fathers before they could marry, or they were disinherited. Sometimes girls were forced into arranged marriages that their fathers planned. Names in those situations were often dictated by or originated from the father. In some places, such in Ireland, I have seen the patriarchal tradition last well into the 19th century, long after it had died in America and in England. Women gained a certain number of rights in the 18th century. They were still not seen as equals to men and could not vote, but they were often allowed to have some say in the running of their households. And in this case, it may mean that women had an increasing choice in the names given to children. So you will see names for persons on her side of the family as well as on the father's. Sometimes the father would give over all of his duties to his wife. And in these dynamics, the mother may have been a member of a church and not the father. So when children were baptized, she had a larger choice in a name. In some religious denominations, including Catholic and Orthodox, the priest assumed a large role in the naming of a child, especially in the 19th and 20th centuries. In the Catholic Church, it was often a requirement that a child have an approved name of a saint. The parents chose a name that did not have clergy approval, the priest would not agree to do the baptism. This was not the case among Protestants, where more esoteric names, including last names used as first names, were more common. As the 19th century wore on, people chose names for children based more on popular fashion than family history. Certain names came to be seen as having talismanic power. The belief came to be that if you gave a certain name to a child, the power within that name would be imbued into the child. Names came to have a mystical quality that had nothing to do at all with family tradition. Going hand in hand with this view is that names have power. Hundreds of books appeared in print with information for prospective parents about choosing baby names. Titles include Cool Names for Babies, The Penguin Book of Baby Names, Name Your Baby's Destiny, and Zodiac Baby Names. Again, family history and tradition has vanished. It is all about what is popular and what will impact the destiny of the young child going forward. The need for choosing exactly the right one requires extensive research into meanings. Some books have appeared for certain ethnicities, like Jewish names and Irish names. Parents choose names from cultural traditions, even if there is no specific family tradition for a particular name. Hollywood, of course, has had a huge impact on names, not only the names of actors and actresses, but also the names of fictional characters in films. Some of the big blockbuster stars of the 1940s and 50s certainly influenced the choice of names, and we see that impact today among the stars of today. One of the interesting names that comes into mind is the 1984 comedy Splash, which starred Daryl Hannah as a mermaid and Tom Hanks as her love interest. The Hanks character tries to find a name for the mermaid, but she chooses Madison after walking down a street in Manhattan and seeing a sign for Madison Avenue. Until that time, Madison had been unheard of as a girl's name, but after the film, Madison became extremely popular in America in the 1980s and 1990s as a girl's name. The movie clearly had a role in establishing the cultural trend. We have been talking up till now about naming customs that affected mainly white people in the British Isles and America. African Americans had their own naming customs traditions that were distinctive and different from white Americans. African names, and to some extent African American slave names, fall into one of the following categories. Events surrounding the birth of the child, such as Ayadel, joy has come to the home. Emotional warnings, such as Namo, which means misfortune in Zimbabwe. Celebrity culture, the order of a child's birth, especially in the case of twins. Day-born names, based on the day of the week when the child was born. Faith-based names, based on African, not Christian culture. Day, night, and season of birth. Ancestral names or the names of senior members of a clan. And nicknames. People brought from Africa and enslaved in America often endured having names chosen for them by their owners. Sometimes these were very common versions of Anglo names like Ned or Betty or Will. Sometimes they were classical sounding names such as Caesar or Apollo, chosen for the amusement of their owners. Certain African names were sometimes preserved as slave names, but it was a rarity. The naming custom using the day of the week on which a child was born as its name survived in some slave cultures. Kujo, Mingo, Kufi, and Kwame were all examples of day names that were derived from the culture of the Akan people in what is now Ghana, Ivory Coast, and Togo. Some African children were also given names based on the circumstances of their birth, such as whether the father acknowledged the baby, whether the father was living or dead, whether the birth came after a long period of childlessness. African names tended to be used in those slave cultures most isolated from European influences, especially in the islands off the coast of Georgia and South Carolina. African names were often more common among slaves and freedmen in the North than in the South, since they enjoyed more freedom to name their children in the North. As slaves became Christianized, it was also common for them to receive biblical names. After slavery, and especially in the second half of the 20th century, modern African Americans have wanted to distance themselves from slavery roots and instead embrace cultural traditions that are not European in origin. The naming of children reflects this trend. As with whites, blacks have an interest in popular culture and in celebrities who are prominent African American celebrities. Such celebrity names have influenced the names of children. Some blacks have also turned to Islam and have chosen Islamic names, such as Muhammad, Aisha, and Aliyah. Some parents have gravitated towards African names or Afrocentric names, which both reflect the growing embrace and influence of African tradition. French names such as Monique, Andre, Antoine, and Beyonce are also more popular among African Americans than among non-French white Americans. Traditional European and biblical names appear, but not with the same frequency as earlier. Finally, there's a strong tradition of inventive names that are created by the child's parents, such names as Lakeisha, Deshaun, Jamarcus, and Shaniqua are all non-European. The practice involves adding one of several prefixes to one of several suffixes. Prefixes can include le or la, ja or je, da or da, or ra or re. Suffixes can include ik or iqua, isha, and on. Many naming possibilities can arise from adding these prefixes and suffixes to a variety of roots, producing names with an African or Afrocentric sound. So far, we have looked at the naming patterns of the British Isles among the many groups of African Americans and African Americans. For the remainder of the talk, I want to look at the naming customs from the continent of Europe. These customs certainly influenced immigrants to America in the early generations, but many immigrants, as I said earlier, dropped many European customs once established on American soil. Still, we need to understand the naming patterns and customs of the countries our ancestors came from in order to understand them better. Unlike the Scots-Irish, those patterns may or may not give us clues about parents. Let's look at German naming practices. Germany is a complex entity made up of many different states, each with very different sets of customs and cultural traditions. Until German unification in 1871, each state was a separate country with distinct dialects. Thus, it is not surprising that naming customs vary greatly, depending on the region of Germany and the religion of the parents. I'm going to talk about each of these in more detail. In some parts of Germany, practices patronymic naming systems, where the first name of the child becomes the last name of the son. In Catholic areas of Germany, it was popular to name children according to what was called naming days, usually a set of days around the feast day of a particular saint, while papal names were also very popular. Some Germans, especially in Lutheran areas, like to name their children after Old Testament patriarchs or religious reformers. Latin and Greek first names were also popular, as were the names of Germanic emperors and kings. Naming children after godparents was a very common practice, both in Germany and among Germans in America, and in some cases, the godparent would actually name the baptized child. Another custom is called rufnamen. Boys would receive the first name of Johann and girls the first name of Maria or Anna. Each would receive a different, distinct middle name, and they would be known or called by that middle name. Among Germans, middle names were more common and used at a much earlier date than in the English tradition. And initials were usually not used. In other parts of Germany, two names used together were considered one name and sometimes hyphenated. In modern Germany, especially before unification, there was a trend among some classes of Germans to give Anglo-sounding names such as Kevin, Mandy, Peggy, and Chantal. Researchers found that children with these names were assumed to come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds and were less discriminated against in schools as having lower performance and behavior problems. This phenomenon is known as Kevinism. In parts of northern Germany, as well as in Scandinavia and even in the Orkney Isles of Scotland, there is a custom called patronymical naming. This system does not dictate how children receive first names, but it does determine their surname. Essentially, the first name of the father becomes the last name of the son. So in this example, Lawrence Garth's son has a son named Garth. Since his father's name was Lawrence, he takes the name of Lawrence's son. If Garth has a son, Theodore, he will have the name Garth's son, the surname Garth's son. His son, William Magnus, has the name Theodore's son. So be aware of this naming system because it will play out in different ways in Dutch records, which we'll talk about in a moment. Sometimes that patronymical name will become a middle name. If your German ancestors were Catholic, especially in Bavaria and Württemberg, they likely followed a custom of naming children after saints. Feast days were common in the church, and in the days leading up to and after a feast, it was common to name a child after the saint, since it was believed that the saint bestowed special protection on that child. These were specifically designated as official naming days, where people were encouraged to honor specific saints in the naming of children. So if you suspect your family may have followed this custom, you should locate the Catholic Church registers for the family and glean the baptismal records of all the children. You will find that in certain parts of Germany, there are regional saints which have special popularity since their relics may be housed in a local church. A disproportionate number of children in generations of a family may have the names of those particular local saints. One of my great-grandfathers came from a part of Bavaria where St. Ursula was a popular saint. Her relics are housed in the local church, so many local children have the name Ursula, which may not be as popular in other parts of Germany or even in Bavaria. One of the best books to learn about saints' feast days and German naming days is The German Research Companion by Shirley Reamer, Roger Meinert, and Jennifer Anderson. It's now in its 3rd edition, and it goes through the calendar year and designates all of the feast days. It also contains an excellent discussion of German naming practices. Here's an example from my own family. I have a great-grandfather who was born a Catholic in Bavaria on June 26, 1869. His name was Johann Baptist Knoll. And the feast day of John the Baptist, St. John the Baptist, is June 24th. So we look at his family, all of the children that his family had. And we can sometimes see the feast day tradition in play, but sometimes we can't. So it's certainly an influential factor, but it's not the sole determining factor. So you'll notice Joseph there, born in March of 1861, right near the feast day of St. Joseph. But the second son, Anton, was born in September. And St. Anthony's feast is July, so he certainly didn't have St. Anthony as a naming day. Andreas, born in November, certainly was named after St. Andrew. John the Baptist. Victoria in December was St. Victoria's feast day. Maria was born in July, and the feast of St. Mary is July 6th. Josepha is a feminized version of Joseph. Wendelin is the name of the father. Francis Xavier is not named after a feast. In this case, it's the name of Wendelin's birth father. So patronymical custom did come into play there, even though the saints' names were also being used. But the mother's family, Kuni's family, Philip and Walburga, were not included among the children at all. So it was not useful to use these names really in trying to project back into earlier generations. You also have to understand that Catholic names are often Latinized when you find them in parish registers, but that's not necessarily the name that the child actually used. For example, a German boy named Karl may be recorded as Carolus in the Catholic register. Ludwig would be Ludovicus, and so on. There are a number of different books that give these variations. So when describing an ancestor or putting his name or her name on your pedigree chart, you probably want to change the name back to the vernacular, which is probably the name by which he or she was actually named, not the Latinized name that was in the book. You also should be aware that foreign names were often translated into English once they came to America. So that was very common. We talked about roof names, and I'm going to show you an example of that. This is another ancestral family of mine. These were Lutherans from the Palatinate area that came into Pennsylvania in the early 1700s. So in this case, there's Johann Conrad Nepper and his wife Anna Katharina Bernhardt, and they're of the village of Sprendlingen. And they have a son, Johann Heinrich, born in 1735, another one, Johann Nicholas, then another Johann Heinrich, who was named for the older brother that died. They have a daughter, Anna Christina, and a daughter, Anna Maria. And finally, they have Paul. And Paul was the only one born in Pennsylvania. All the others were born in Germany. So what does this tell us exactly here? Well, it shows that Johann was the roof name. It was all the sons were given that name as their first name, but they probably were named or called by their second name. Parents were very interested in naming the child after a deceased earlier child. So we have that as a clue, and we have the Annas there. But once they were in Pennsylvania, the roof name custom died, and they started giving a new first name without the roof name. So Paul, and since instead of Johann Paul, he's just Paul. So you have to be aware this system was very much in play, especially in the Palatinate area of Western Germany. Using church records, we can sometimes get clues, and a very common practice among Germans and German Americans was naming children after godparents. This custom was practiced extensively by Germans from Hanover and Westphalia. It was very common among the Missouri Synod Lutherans here in Allen County and elsewhere where the Missouri Synod Church was popular. So here's a page out of St. Peter's Lutheran Church here in Allen County. In the first example, we see the baptism of Heinrich Friedrich Wilhelm, the son of Heinrich Beatty and his wife Louisa Schaefer, originally from Petershagen in Kreismünden, Westphalia. His godparents were Wilhelm Schaefer and Friedrich Thiele, and both names are incorporated into his birth name. It was common for Missouri Synod Lutherans to give their children 3 names, and the child would often be called by the second or third name. However, this was different than the rufname system, since the first name would be given multiple times. So in the second example, we see Anna Maria Sophie, the daughter of Johann Rudolf Wirth and his wife Wilhelmina Louise Becker. The godparents were Mrs. Maria Elizabeth Becker, Mrs. Sophia Bushy, and Wilhelmina Charlotte Becker. So we see the first 2 of the 3 names were derived from the godparents, Anna and Maria and Sophie. So it's interesting to see these patterns being at work here, but it shows that they were using godparents' names rather than grandparents in the namings of the children. The naming systems of France and Switzerland are presently governed by very specific rules. Only the names from approved lists can be used. It is not permitted to give a last name as a first name to a child, which clashes directly with the Scots-Irish and American naming practices. It is unlawful for a parent to give a child a name that is considered harmful to a child, like Adolf Hitler. Biblical names are permitted, but not the names of biblical villains, such as Cain or Judas. Cannot use either brand names or place names as first names. You cannot give a boy a girl's name or a girl a boy's names, nor can you invent a name. That seems very restrictive by American practices. Historical names were not regulated by the government, but there was a much smaller range of names used in France and Switzerland than there were in other countries. The Swiss have no particular naming pattern or custom. According to the late Louis Hunker Rohrbach, one will sometimes see the name of the eldest son named after the father's father and the eldest daughter named after the mother's mother, but just as often you will see a child given the name of one of the 2 grandparents of the same sex at the time of baptism. So you cannot rely on Swiss names genealogically for determining earlier generations. As I said, the Swiss used a very short range of names for their children. A good list can be found in Rohrbach's book called Guide to Swiss Genealogical Research. Sometimes you will see regional and local variants. For example, the name Oswald is a very uncommon first name, but you will see it with some consistency in the town of Sumiswald, where there was a favorite, but almost nowhere else. Sometimes the minister appears to have chosen the child's name at baptism, or he appears to have used a variation of the name according to either Hochdeutsch or Berndeutsch, the Low German dialect used in Switzerland. Thus, a boy given the German name of Christian might be entered as Christen, pronounced Christi with no final end. Magdalena might be Madlena or Madly. Ulrich may be recorded as Uli. It can be difficult to know what variation of the name a person used later when they became an adult. However, it's important to record whatever variant you find, because that same variant may persist later in other records. Sometimes a child will have 2 names, like Hans Uli. Usually this will appear in later records. Occasionally after 1800, you will find the 2 names combined. Hans Uli. The variant should be recorded as one single name. It is very common in Switzerland for a later child to be named after an earlier child who died, the process known as necronyms. Finally, you will sometimes find 2 identical names for 2 different children in a family, both of whom lived. This usually happens when there is some distance of time between the first and the second, and usually the children are born to different mothers. This fact threw me when I encountered it in doing Swiss research, but I now understand the custom, so it makes a lot more sense to me. Like Catholics in France and Germany, the Spanish will often name their children after saints using the Roman Catholic calendar of feasts as a guide. Interspersed with these names are names unique to Spain that have historical or cultural significance. Under the dictator Francisco Franco and earlier, there were restrictions on approved names like that of France, but today, most of those restrictions have been lifted. Modern day Spaniards can choose whatever name they wish, so long as it will not be deemed harmful to the child. There is one exception: nicknames cannot be used as official names. I want to just briefly talk about Dutch surnames. the eldest son for the father's father, second son for the mother's father, eldest daughter for the father's mother, second daughter for the mother's mother. This was a common custom used among the Dutch in New Netherland and early New York in the 1600s. Other names came from different sources, such as other relatives like aunts and uncles. The Dutch liked to use necronyms after naming children after children who died. Likewise, if a father died when his wife was pregnant, she gave that name to the son. He would be named for the father. If the mother died in childbirth and she had a daughter, the girl would be named for the mother. Sometimes you will find a patronymic system in Dutch records where the middle name is as a person to be a patronymic, incorporating the name of the father. And this may also be a surname. The surname may be related to the place where the family lived, especially if they moved from the Netherlands to New York. Often it will have the root of the name with an adjective such as Z, S-Z-E-N, S-E-N, or S-E. Believe it or not, there's 6 names here, and they're all to the same person. Cornelius Antonissen van Slyke, Cornelius Tunissen, Cornelius Antonissen van Breukelen, Cornelius van Breukelen, Cornelius Antonissen van Slicht, and Cornelius Tunissen van Slicht, all of the same person. So it can be very tricky in getting through these Dutch records at that time, just because of all the variations that can be in play. The Scandinavian customs, first name for the father's father, second name for the mother's father, later sons after great grandfathers or uncles, first daughter for the father's mother, second daughter for the mother's mother, later daughters for great grandmothers or aunts. The second, naming a daughter from the second marriage after the deceased wife from the first marriage, which is kind of interesting. If a man marries a second time, his first wife dies, it's very common for the first wife to be named in the second marriage. Jewish naming customs, Ashkenazi Jews believed in naming children after ancestors, but never after a living forebear. In posthumous births, the son would be given the name of his father. Among the Sephardic Jewish customs, the eldest son for the father's father, second son for the mother's father, third son for the paternal great-grandfather, which is a little different than some of the other customs. I won't have time to get into the customs because we're running out of time for this particular one, but just some closing advice here. When using names effectively in genealogical research, record all the names of all the children of the ancestor couple, if possible. If you're extracting names out of church records, say in Europe, make sure you get all the names. Use wills, deeds, church records, cemetery records, census records, vital records. You may not be able to find them all, since some may have died young without any record at all. Identify birth order. If possible, sometimes the order of children's names in a will or a probate file will be their birth order. Or sometimes the boys will be listed in birth order, then the girls in birth order. Having the full family may but not always help identify earlier generations. And finally, know the ancestral naming culture. That's the most important thing to be aware of when we're studying this. Thank you, and I'll be happy to take some questions.
We do have a few questions here. So the first one comes from Ellen, and she's asking, with Irish naming practices, is there a difference between Catholic and Protestant families?
I think among the Catholics, the priest had a lot more influence in the naming of a child. So you'll see a lot more saints' names being used in the Catholic Church, whereas Protestants would not have that same kind of restriction. The clergy did not have the same kind of power. So you'll find names among Protestants that would be not necessarily saints' names. You'll find, like in my own family's instance, the Dempster name, which was a last name being used as a first name. You would not see that name in a Catholic family. So you won't see the more unusual names in the Catholic tradition than you will in the Protestant.
Our second question is from Lori, and she's asking if you have any information on naming patterns of Austro-Hungarian of that period. She says many immigrants had large families and were also very religious.
I don't know that much about them. I suspect the Austrian tradition was very similar to the German traditions, and I suspect if they were Catholic, they were very possibly following the saints' names around those times. So I'd look very carefully at that. They may have chosen names after emperors and kings in that culture too. So that's would be my advice. There might be some books on it, but I'm not well equipped on that.
Someone's asking if you might be able to speak to the naming pattern of Irish who emigrated to America in the late 1840s and were having their children in the early 1850s.
Well, by that time, the oldest son after the father's father was beginning to wane a little bit. You still might see that in play in a lot of families, but I wouldn't say that it's absolutely certain. You might see a father's name ending up as a middle name rather than as the name of the first name. So people were trying to assimilate. They were trying to get accustomed to American life. And so those traditions were beginning to wear away and they were becoming more American. So I would say that cultural naming pattern was not nearly as strong as what it would have been a generation earlier in Ireland.
Our next one is from Linda. She says, I've encountered the name, I'm not sure how to say it, Elisha. Um, she says, I think the name is for a female. Would it be a female name derived from a male's name?
That can happen sometimes. That there could have been a son that died, and then a daughter came along, and they wanted to honor the son that had died, so they would choose a feminized version of it, or it could be just a name in the family somewhere. It's very unusual. It's hard to tell. It's something you need to explore.
Martha asked if you've heard of the names Free Love and True Love, and maybe where those came from or how those
Absolutely, those
were
are
formed.
also very much Quaker and virtue names. You certainly see them among Quakers and Puritans too. And I think we don't think of free love in the hippie sense of it that way, but we think of it as God's gift of love to humanity. And so it comes from that virtue of God's love.
Thank you for presenting, and thank you to everybody for attending. And for a copy of the chat, if you'd like a copy of the chat from today's Zoom, you're welcome to email us at genealogy@acpl.info. Or if you have questions that pop up or questions that we didn't get to, please send us an email there and we'll be happy to take a look. So thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.